Okay, so the first part of the IA is called research design. This is the first criteria. It's worth 6 points out of 24 points. If we focus on the 5, 6 level descriptors, we can see that it talks about a research question that has specific and appropriate context, and then it has methodological considerations associated with collecting relevant and sufficient data, and the description of the methodology for collecting or selecting data allows for the investigation to be reproduced. Okay, so basically, the design of your experiment, the design of your IA, has to have a research question. It has to have appropriate context, and that includes background info so that the context can be specific and fully explained. And then it has to have a method, and that method has to be complete, has to be logical, it has to show that you're planning to collect enough data and that the way you're doing it is reliable so that the data will be useful to answering the research question. Okay, now that's kind of simplistic, so let's get into some more details about what goes into each one of these sections. So if you look here, this is also from the same page where the criteria is. The research question with context should contain reference to the dependent and independent variables and include a concise description of the system in which the research question is embedded and include background theory of direct relevance. I really don't know how you get all that into a research question. This part seems like it would kind of be after the research question. But a research question is something along the lines of how does changing X affect Y, being the independent and dependent variables, and then with some additional descriptive detail in there so that it's clear what specific system you're looking at. So you wouldn't just say, I want to investigate how does temperature affect reaction rate. You would want to say, I want to how does temperature, and then in parentheses, in this range, affect the reaction rate of this particular reaction, and you could even include detail about what method you might be using to measure that. So you give a little bit of detail so that it can be really focused. The methodological considerations, you have to look at how you're going to measure dependent variable, so methods for measuring things. If you're using databases at all or simulations, you could mention that, although that's not as common in chemistry. The scope, quantity, and quality of measurements. So when you think about what the values of temperature are going to be, you have to, and I'll go into this more, but you have to include some reasoning, or at least show through the values that you've chosen that you've thought about your particular topic. So for example, later on they talk about how if you're investigating dissolved oxygen in ocean water, well, the temperature of the ocean doesn't really ever get much above 30 degrees Celsius. So if you were to investigate 50 degrees Celsius, that wouldn't really make a lot of sense for your chosen research question. So they don't want you to just be blindly picking values. They want you to think about the relevance or the context of your question and then pick values that make sense for that particular context. So what the values are, how many repeats you're going to do, things like that, identifying control variables and how you're going to control them, and then safety issues, environmental issues, ethical issues, stuff like that. And essentially, you need to include enough detail so that someone could, in theory, repeat the investigation. Okay, this text here now is straight from the IB website for teachers. This is telling me as a teacher what I should check for the first part, thinking about the research question and the context. So it's your own question. It mentions independent and dependent. The variables are quantifiable, which means they are changing quantitatively, right, with numbers. There's background context or theory that's relevant and focused. The context of the independent dependent variables is relevant and focused. And then this is for if you choose databases, you've explained the choices there. Okay. Yeah, this part is really fine. Just make sure that your research question mentions what the independent and dependent variable are, and then you make some connection of why is this investigation relevant? What is the context? So to me, the context is about the relevance of this question and the background information that explains what you think the relationship might be between your independent and dependent variable. So it says here at the very end, you don't have to include a hypothesis. If you do, you will then have to refer back to it later, whether or not it's supported in the conclusion. But I actually think even if you don't include one, having that in mind, that what you're trying to include in your background information, you're trying to include information that will allow you to write a hypothesis, to write a prediction. So if you're going to do that, you're going to have to explain what your independent variable is, how and what is the content that explains how the independent variable will affect the dependent variable. So you want to be able to explain or predict the effect between the independent and the dependent variable, which is essentially writing a hypothesis. So if you feel like you've written enough information to make that prediction, then you've probably covered all the relevant content, background context to support your investigation. This is a chemistry class, so make sure that if your IA involves a chemical reaction or multiple reactions, make sure you have correctly balanced chemical equations with corresponding state symbols. So aqueous, liquid, gas, things like that. Yep, you are permitted to present more than one independent variable. Just do so carefully. If you choose too many things to investigate, you might not have enough time to treat them all in the appropriate depth. So it's better to do one independent variable really well with more data so you can really answer the question than to go after too many things and do a kind of superficial job. Okay, when you then go on to the method, the method can be written in different ways, step by step, in tables, in paragraphs. There's all sorts of different ways to do it. What I'm supposed to be checking for is that it can generate data that will answer the question. And you have to explain how you're going to collect the relevant data. What's kind of new here compared to the old IA criteria, although I kind of always ask people to do this anyways, is you need to sort of justify why you're doing things the way you're doing them. They want you to explain your reasoning for particular method steps or the particular range of values that you're testing. And it's kind of built in to the time allotment for the IA is an expectation that part of the time is going towards you doing some preliminary trials. And they want that to be described, and they want you to assess in the terms of, like, you should be trying your method out first, thinking about how well it went, thinking about the data that you collected, maybe processing the data that you collected, and then you use that to go back and revise your method. So this, you might decide to organize this as a section before you actually do your final method. I used to always tell people, and I guess I still will, to include a method development section. And this could include any data that you collect in these sort of pre-trials. And it can be a description of your thinking and your problem solving and any changes that you made to your initial plan. So they want to see that this is your investigation and that you didn't just take a method without thinking about it and try it, and then those are the results you get. You're welcome to find information to help you with your method from other sources, but then they want to see that you've made it your own. And the way you make it your own is by trying it out, thinking about the results you got, and then modifying it to make it whatever you decide on in the end. Describe how you measure independent variable, the range and intervals of the independent variable, things like that. How you're going to control variables, ones that you can't control, kind of recognizing that, and so on. So this is the method development section again. Make sure there's an account of like the the practice stuff that you've done. The method that you eventually include should not be a proposed plan. It should be the actual method that you followed. And that's why you kind of have to come up with a rough method plan. You're going to try it out in these pre-trials. You'll make some modifications, and then what you do present is the final method. So the 10-hour IA allotment may include a certain amount of designing and trialing and redesigning. And so that's kind of part that's built into the IA plan. You obviously need to explain procedures and include details about equipment. Don't tell me that you're using a graduated cylinder. Tell me you're using a 10 milliliter graduated cylinder. Don't tell me you're using a balance. Tell me you're using a balance that measures to plus or minus 0.01 grams. And these are places where you can show thoughtfulness too. If you're going to do a lab that involves change in mass and the mass changes are really small, then using a balance that only measures to the 10th place doesn't show much thoughtfulness, because you're not going to have enough precision there to see the changes. So you have to think about your equipment and make sure it's precise enough to actually give you measurable changes in your results. For independent variable, they say a minimum of 5 different values is kind of the expectation. You need to give rationale for the range that you're using, so the range of temperatures, and the intervals, meaning how far apart they are. So you need to justify that, give your thinking behind that. It may or may not, depending on your topic, how you sample something. So, if you take a water sample from an actual source, they give an example here about a swimming pool and the chlorine in the swimming pool. Well, taking water from the top of the pool versus the bottom of the pool may have different concentrations. They mention how if you test a particular wine for something, not all red wine is the same. So be really specific in terms of recognizing that you're just taking a particular sample. When possible, try to mitigate that issue. But if it's not possible, at least show recognition that what you're testing on is just a particular sample and doesn't represent all red wine or all pool water or whatever. Okay. Obviously, you want to try to control variables and explain how you're going to control variables, but also identify variables you can't control. Try to monitor ones that can't be controlled. So if there's, the pressure of the room is not something you can control, but you could take measurements of it so that you were confident it was within a certain range. You might assume certain things are controlled. If you are taking samples, then there are certain things outside of your control. You can't control how the red wine was made. You have no idea what was going on in those grapes and the soil and things like that. So, but recognition of that shows your awareness and your thoughtfulness. Things like room temperature. Don't just say I did it at room temperature. Don't say you're controlling room temperature with the thermostat. You still have to measure the temperature of your solutions and things before you use them. Stuff like that. So they just want to see your thoughtfulness, that you're not like over assuming things, that you're checking on things as you go. Okay. And finally, risk assessment. So it's an expectation probably right before your method or just after your method that you talk about safety. So for every chemical that you're going to use, you should be looking up in CLIAPS in addition to other sources. You want to check what are the hazards. And this is with citations. So what are the hazards of that chemical? You want to be mindful that sometimes something is very hazardous at a high concentration and it's less hazardous when the concentration is lower. So make sure that the hazards you talk about are actually specific to the form of the chemical and the concentration of the chemical that you're using. If you include a bunch of other stuff that's not relevant, you'll get dinged for that. So talk about the hazards and the safety procedures you're going to follow to make sure that this is a safely done lab. Judicious consumption of materials. Don't use a liter of solution every trial, right? Try to use small amounts when possible to minimize waste. And even if a lab tech is disposing of the waste, it's expected that you have researched how the waste gets disposed of. You must explicitly describe disposal methods for specific chemicals and organic matter, even if someone else is doing it. Also something that gets a citation. Okay, so they want to see that you're going to be carrying this out safely. Safety has to do with chemicals in our class. It has to do with anytime we are burning things. We need to be aware of the fire hazards and safety measures in the room. Anything with high heat, anything with electricity. There's a bunch of different aspects of safety that we need to be aware of, and we want to try to show that we're thought about all of them. Then we have our method here. You can include, it says illustrations. If you want, like diagrams, that's great. It can save you some writing. There is a 3,000 word limit on this IA, and so a picture is maybe not worth 1,000 words, but it can be worth many words. And if you have it in the diagram and it's clearly labeled, you can probably get away with writing a lot less and just saying, set up lab equipment as shown below. Don't include superfluous extra pictures like it mentions here. A picture of a conical flask or a burette is just a waste of everybody's time because we all know what those look like. But a picture of how you are setting your stuff up that's labeled could be really, really helpful. Lists of materials are not required. You can include materials so long as they're detailed enough. You can include that in the method steps itself. I'd say that's great. I don't usually spend much time reading the material list. I want to see how the materials are mentioned in the method steps themselves. And I think I skipped at some point, it mentions citations. You are expected to cite sources appropriately with like in-text citations and a work cited. So these would be for specific facts or data values. And also if any of your method ideas or procedures came from certain places. And then for the safety and disposal stuff, that should be cited as well, okay? It's not one particular method you have to use. So long as you are consistent, then you'll be fine. I would use Noodle Tools and MLA for consistency, and then you'll have covered yourself. So a lot goes into the research design section. It really sets the stage for the report. It really boils down to just a research question, the background info and context, and the method. That's kind of how it's laid out. Or you could say method development followed by the final method. And laying out, in terms of the method, there's the variables that you need to identify, as well as the sort of procedures, the step-by-step procedures that you're going to follow. So I know this was a long video, it kind of rambles on, but I hope it addresses your questions about what goes into research design and how you can earn a high score on this kind of opening part of your investigation.